I just wanted to start by explaining why we started the Bear and the Butterfly. It is a part of a bigger project that we call the Consider Project. I was a CPA, an accountant, graduated from University of Washington, and in 2007, my older sister was killed in a bicycling accident, at which time I got a phone call from my father. She was killed instantly. And sitting in the back of an alley, I received a message, and the message was, ask people to consider. And so I shared that message at her memorial service, and we started, this was over 10 years ago, a series of concerts, benefit concerts for the Tate and David Evanger Rainey Foundation. We called the Consider Concerts. And then I took some break. I went back to school to study theology and seminary. I started asking big questions about life, and eventually I became a pastor, so I'm also a pastor as well as the founder of the Consider Project. And now we are restarting something that has been going for quite some time, since 2007, and we're finding new, exciting ways to just have big conversation, to consider well together as a community. And this is sort of the first reiteration of the Consider Project. And so we're really excited about this. We're still learning, but we want to have more events like this, events where we can come together in a city like ours and ask big questions and talk about important things, matters of great concern. And so we want to talk about them from a full array of positions. And so one of the cool things that we believe about considering, so we're actually putting together a website right now, and a friend of ours who does this sort of thing asked, what are the 5 words that explain the Consider Project? And so I just want to share those because I think they're informative to what we are creating. I want to invite you guys to be a part of creating this kind of community, this kind of free, open space in our city where we can talk about these things. And the first word was fun. That was the first word. Tyler and I were friends before we started doing this together. And we think getting together and considering big things is fun. It's not stuffy, it's not boring, it's actually quite fun. In fact, we have this human capacity to consider transcendent things, deep things, true things, real things, beautiful things. And when you actually exercise that muscle, what we hope that you find and what we found is that it's actually quite fun. It's actually quite fun. I like to use the analogy of running. You know, I've got 2 little boys, a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, and I remember the first time I saw my older boy run for the first time. You start to walk, and you're like, this is pretty amazing, but then when you realize that you can run, just the joy of having both of your feet off the ground at the same time. That's actually the definition of running, if you've ever watched Speed Walking Olympics. To have both feet off the ground. That, to me, is what considering is. It's fun. It's joyful. And a lot of people are living their whole life just walking, and we want to help people to run and think with their whole minds. But it's a muscle you have to exercise. It's hard to run if you haven't done it in a while. And so that's part of why we get together, is to have fun and exercise those muscles. The other word that comes to mind is more. There is more to life than many of us experience. There's more to the life of the mind, the life of the heart and the soul than most people get to experience. And that is, maybe they're not invited into these kinds of conversations or this kind of community. So we want you to experience more, not only deep things, but just more in the way of community and connection and all these amazing parts of life. The third word that comes to mind is freedom. And so one of the ways that we talk about that at the Consider Project is, first, we want this space to be a space of freedom, that there is nothing off limits, there is no category of thought, experiment that you cannot engage in. Sometimes you might feel that way in your job or at your family dinner table, that you're not allowed to bring up categories, for instance, maybe like faith, or maybe like science, or maybe like bioethics. And we're going to talk about all of them together, but there's freedom here, and we want to be promoters of freedom, because we think where there's freedom, there's great consideration, and great consideration leads to truth, and truth leads to the common good, and so we want to be a place of freedom. But we don't just want that for ourselves. We want that for all people in all places at all times, and that's sort of the grand vision of the Consider Project. So every dollar that you've donated for your ticket here will go directly to through the Kim Evanger Foundation and to an organization that we believe is working for freedom in some way around the world. Because if you do not have freedom, if you are enslaved, if you do not have the freedom of knowing where your next meal is coming from, if you are enslaved by thirst or hunger or your borders, you cannot have the space and the freedom necessary to truly consider well. And so each and every Consider event, we will give 100% of everything that we raise away, and we'll pick one charity that we believe in. And so tonight, all the money that we've raised up will go to the International Justice Mission, which is working against human trafficking and slavery around the world. On your note sheet, you can see a little description of the International Justice Mission, and just know, here's what we believe. When we get together, when we exercise this privilege and this freedom that we have to consider, that we should also be considering others and hope to pass that on to somebody else in the world that doesn't have the freedom to consider. We believe it to be a basic human right, and we know not everybody has it. So that's the Consider Project. Every event we do, whether it is a concert or it's a Bear and the Butterfly, and we'll just keep adding to the banquet of places where we can consider well. The last two are curiosity, self-explanatory. Be curious and ask good questions. And one of the ways we'll do that tonight, we'll have a few Q&A times. And there's 3 cards. They don't say what they are. They're just the event logo. Those are question cards. We want you to write a question, and we'll stop twice throughout the night. And this is a public conversation. We want you to engage with us. And we'll have some fun ways of pulling your engagement out. We have a little bingo machine, and so you have a number on your card, and you don't have to participate if you don't want, but just we want you to know that you are a considerer. You're not just a consumer, but you have ideas and thoughts, and one of the great ways to start considering well is to ask great questions, okay? And then the final word is connect. You could go listen to a great podcast on bioethics and faith and science. There's lots of them out there. But there is nothing like being in a room with other human beings that you can connect to. And that, I think, is a missing piece. We have access to so much information in our world, and we should be thankful for that. I was thankful for that preparing for this. But there is nothing like getting together to consider. There's nothing like connecting. And so we want to create a community for people that really do want to connect and consider well together. So that's the Consider Project, and the Bear and the Butterfly forums are a part of that. And so we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for helping us start something new and hopefully exciting and fun in our city. And I would love to have you continue to participate in these. But now let's get into it, and I want to invite our distinguished guest. Can I call you distinguished?
You can call me whatever you want.
Okay, I'll call you distinguished. This is Dr. Tyler Tate. He is a pediatric palliative care physician, an assistant professor of pediatrics, and he holds the Miles J. Edwards Endowed Chair of Medical Ethics at Oregon Health and Science University. Used to live in Seattle, now lives in Portland, but we still love him dearly. And Tyler, would you just tell us your story? In particular, would you just tell us how did you get into bioethics as a profession? And tell us a little bit about the ups and downs of your own life when it comes to how faith and science have interacted over the years.
I'd be happy to. Thank you guys all for coming out on Sunday night. I know it's already late, and I'm grateful that you guys are all here. It's interesting to come here because there's a sense where I feel like I sort of am a fraud because many of you guys are my good friends who kind of grew up with me, and now I'm, as Dave said, faculty at OHSU and have a neat position where I get to really do ethics and write and publish in these different domains. So I sometimes am just as surprised, how did I get to where I am? So I'll try and describe that briefly. And the stories of my faith and religion are intertwined with the story of just who I am and why I'm here. So those will sort of be presented together. But I grew up in a Christian home and in a sort of tradition, a very charismatic sort of tradition. And as many people do, go to college and then start having to face some major questions about who we are, how do I trust my senses to deliver knowledge, and what are the different kinds of knowledge. So I was a pre-med student, and as some of you know, when you're a pre-med student, you have to be very grade conscious, as I was, but I somehow got duped into taking a philosophy course when I was a freshman. Logic, which seemed safe, but it was not. And through learning about some of the Enlightenment thinkers, in particular a guy named Immanuel Kant, I realized that my beliefs in God were very different than my beliefs in, say, the fact that I had a black Labrador retriever named Jack, or that I believed that my mom loved me. But my belief in a story that happened thousands of years ago and was written down in a book that has been edited multiple times was a different kind of belief. And I don't know if any of you have had this sort of sudden recognition that there's an instability to faith. And this was quite unnerving. But what I did was I pressed in because I thought, wow, this is a really fascinating sort of set of questions. And so I ended up double majoring in molecular biology and philosophy and kind of pushing the boundaries of those questions. But I will tell you the truth, I am still living in the exhaust fumes of those questions, meaning I have not answered them. And I have lots of doubts and I have lots of faith, and they're intermingled in a way that is both tragic and beautiful, and have sort of inspired me to be where I am today. But I ultimately went into pediatrics and went to medical school in Alabama, at University of Alabama, and then came out here to University of Washington to do my residency in pediatrics and got interested in ethics re-interested in ethics, I should say, through some mentorship at UW, and then ultimately went and got a master's degree in bioethics and did a palliative care fellowship at Duke University because I found that Duke was a place where the Divinity School and the School of Medicine, there was a lot of cross-examination and sort of a real way where religion, science, medicine were being seen as sort of co-collaborators in a really beautiful and rich story. So, and then I missed the mountains and snowboarding, so I got a sweet job back at OHSU, and I came back. It's not UW, you know, it's Portland. It's a great time. So, you know, I think in terms of bioethics, it's a really kind of amorphous idea. What is that? What does it mean? And how do these different domains sort of circulate with each other? You know, my mom is a special ed teacher. And in particular, she works with kids who are have severe cognitive disability and are deaf and blind. So I grew up hanging out with those kids. If you grew up hanging out with kids who are sort of the most radically vulnerable population in the world, you learn what radical dependency is, right? And those kids, from a long time ago, from when I was a kid, reminded me and continue to remind me that the idea that self-actualization and preference satisfaction, which is one of the major worlds of ethics called utilitarianism, which maybe we'll get into, where the right decision, the right way to live, and the right way to build society is where autonomous, rational individuals can maximize their preferences. Well, these kids sort of were a constant reminder that they didn't really fit into that algorithm. What about someone who can't talk or even perhaps think? And the best they can do, you know, working at Seattle, I know a lot of my nurse friends here, a baby with virtually no brain, the best they can do is lay there and receive love. But is that not morally important? So those questions really kind of haunted me, and as I did my pediatrics and saw what those kind of lives are like, made me realize, man, I want to critically think about how we can live together and commit ourselves to create a flourishing community that does not, from the outset, not include people who are really unlike sort of the model that a lot of ethics is built around. So those questions and that story has really motivated me to continue to ask questions, and then I have found religion and science and ethics to actually be easy bed partners, which is not always sort of as they were described. And now, in my new position, I have the opportunity to really kind of be a leader in how those worlds act to each other.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, we're so glad that you're here. Thanks for coming up from Portland and being with us. And, we've got to have lots of these conversations over the years. And I think the question, just to start with, why is this worth our time? Why is it worth the time to talk about where is the intersection, or is there an intersection, or can science, faith, and bioethics come together for human flourishing and for the common good? That's sort of why we're here. We think that they can, but they haven't always. And so just this week I was listening to a podcast that reminded us of that, and I never knew about this, but in the 1960s, a majority of phase 1 medical pharmaceutical research was done on inmates. And nobody really batted an eye. People knew about it. They just thought, well, it has to be done on someone. And it got a bit out of hand. I mean, there's many stories from this. You can look up these articles. One, I think, that finally caught the attention of much of the American public was, and having a young child, I know this, tear-free shampoo. Well, how did they find out it was tear-free? Well, they were going into and paying inmates to allow them to do the research, and they would literally hold their eyes open and drop soap into their eyes to see what would happen. And lots of stories injecting inmates with diseases, hepatitis, and some other things. And eventually they said, we need to stop this. But that for so long it went on. Why is that? And can we, if we're allowing all the information and knowledge to come together, can we stop those sorts of things from happening as well? So, I don't know. Why is this conversation important to you?
I at some point in the night, I'm going to get up and just start preaching, but not yet. I get very passionate about these things because they're really important. At some point, maybe a question will be, what do we mean when we talk about what is religion, what is science, and what is bioethics? Well, I'll start with the third and say briefly, bioethics is a response to the questions Dave just raised, okay? And a really important thing, the old adage from Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living, right? Why do we want to consider questions? Because, guess what? We are oftentimes immune to or unaware of the wrong things that are being committed around us. We become sort of unaware. It's sort of like a fish, right? The old story of the fish swimming around in water has no sense that there is land because all it knows is water, right? This is why some of our most egregious things that humankind has done, let's look at slavery. Why was it that so few people were crying out against slavery? It's because they lived in a world where they were handed norms, and those norms were unquestioned, and they did not even recognize that there was sort of these egregious things happening around them. So bioethics as a field and as a set of questions emerged out of World War II primarily. So the Nazis, Dave and I were talking about this before, we're like, you never want to bring up the Nazis. There's actually a law in philosophy. Once you bring the Nazis into the argument is over because it is always the trump card. But that is not what we're doing. So they did a lot of experiments on disabled people. They had a whole sterilization program for people who were, as they were called then, mentally retarded. And once the war ended, there was something called the Nuremberg trials where the whole world suddenly went in and saw what was happening. I mean, and that's not even to mention all of the, the most egregious, horrible things such as the extermination of the Jewish people that we all recognize. And people for the first time sort of started realizing or asking the question, can we do whatever we want to people who can't sort of give their consent? Can we just do an experiment on a prisoner? Can we just do an experiment on a disabled child? And our public consciousness, thank God, started recognizing, no, actually we cannot. And these questions started percolating in the United States in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. People started asking these same kind of questions. So in Alabama, there was these famous trial and horrible experiments that people were doing on African American men where they were giving them syphilis and then not telling them, and then watching how it killed them over a course of years. There's a really famous, sort of infamous experiment that a man did at an orphanage called Willowbrook, where he gave all of these disabled children hepatitis and then watched what would happen to them. And no one was questioning these things. In fact, they were applauding them because they said, well, how else are we going to acquire this knowledge, right? So knowledge was, in a sense, being worshipped as sort of the ultimate goal. Knowledge, scientific progress, these mythologies that were sort of structuring how we thought about what is good, what is right. And out of that series of recognitions that we can't just do whatever we want to powerless people, emerged this field called bioethics, which just is, bio, life, and ethics, sort of morality, right and wrong. And that sort of engine started kind of driving us into where we are today. That's just a super brief history. But the point that I want you guys to sort of chew on is that, is to ask yourself, what are you comfortable with today? What am I comfortable with today that in 50 years or 100 years will be looked back upon like the Willowbrook injecting children with hepatitis that everyone was applauding? There are many examples of this. And things just sort of go on. And to me, that's the real being woke, is to recognize that I'm given a series of norms, and unchallenged, I may be being baptized into some really bad things, unless I look critically at what I am doing and the actions I'm committing. And that's ethics.
Yeah. Well, and so the thesis, or where we're going to be moving today, is this, that we both agree that the more streams of knowledge and wisdom we can bring into the discussion of bioethics, or ethics in general, but particularly in bioethics, the better chance we have as a community and a society to reach bioethical standards and norms that lead to human flourishing and the common good, and we don't get caught up in these blind spots and traps of thinking. And you say, of course. You say, of course, right? Of course, we all agree on that we should, as much knowledge and wisdom and as many streams as we can bring together, yes, let's do that, and that must be what we're doing, of course, right? And the answer is, unfortunately, no. There is, as I said, not freedom to bring in knowledge and wisdom from every source. And so I've heard Tyler talk about this as a bioethicist and as a pediatrician. And so why don't you, is that true? What I'm saying is that all streams of knowledge and wisdom are not invited into a lot of these conversations?
Yeah. I mean, I think, from the title of this talk, bioethics, science, religion, the fact that Dave's a pastor, that sort of one of the major things we want to discuss and think through together, right? Because I really do. I'm super excited for the questions. Hope you guys are thinking about them. Do I have plants? No. I don't. I did tell Joe. These sort of ideas oftentimes get siloed away from each other. I am lived in the Pacific Northwest most of the last decade, and I work in secular universities, and it's difficult to have the domains of religion and faith, science, and the scientific method, right? Hypothesis testing, and sort of ethics, all talk to each other. And the question is, do they inform each other? And how do they? And why is there this sort of common sort of idea in our culture that they have to be separated, that there are barriers between thinking about God and thinking about testing a scientific hypothesis? So I think I'll say a few words about this sort of history.
Yeah.
Yes?
Well, the question is...
I'm right, getting off track.
No, you're doing a great job. The question, though, we're saying is, well, why not?
Yeah.
Why not? And I think we do need to look at the history of the relationship between science and faith and understand the real history to start to understand why today, particularly in a city like Seattle, for instance, there is this divide. And I would just say from a historical perspective, a perspective of from Christianity at least, well, what we realize is that science and faith have not always been in tension, that they've not been kept in separate rooms, and they always were working together. If you study faith and science, particularly the Christian faith, you realize that science really came from a Christian understanding of the world, which said that there is a rational God who has created a rational planet and human beings, and he's given them rational minds so that they might understand the creation and use the creation and mold it in such a way as to bring the most potential benefit to the most potential people. That has always been a Christian understanding, and so science and faith have not been at odds. In fact, thanks to the church and Christianity, we have a lot of modern medicine and hospitals and those sorts of things. And those, you can look those things up and read about the history of those things. But it's only maybe been in the last 100 years that we've thought about this tension or this either or of science and faith. And so I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about why you think that tension exists from a historical perspective. And then we'll start to ask the question of where do we go from here?
Yeah. Thanks. I think, and to note that I think we'll talk. I'll talk a little bit more in a few minutes, kind of about how Jewish thought, Christian thought, conceptualize a world that is ordered and that there are laws that are discoverable. Which was the milieu out of which science really emerged. But just, I think, as we were talking about this, kind of pulling this down in my own life, I have struggled and continue to struggle with understanding how science responds to religious belief and vice versa. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you kind of open your ears to how these worlds are discussed or thought about, especially in a place like the Pacific Northwest, it is seen sort of as enemies, right? That's the kind of cultural kind of motif that we oftentimes hear. And so why is that? Well, what is most often pointed to? I do think a brief sort of historical reflection on science and religion and then science and ethics and religion and ethics is helpful. So you have the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment was this period in the 1600s, 1700s, where people sort of, the story goes, threw off the shackles of religious belief. And the Catholic Church in Europe, and a major part of that story is a story of removing the earth from the center of the universe and replacing it with the sun, right? That's Nikolai Copernicus and the Copernican revolution. And then you hear about Galileo, who took Copernicus's ideas and started sort of preaching them to Europe. And what happened to Galileo? We hear, right? Shut down by the Catholic Church. Persecuted and shut down. And then we move, so as I see it, that's kind of one major step in, and I'm not saying for or against right now, I'm sort of just presenting how we think about it, right? That was sort of step one. The earth was dethroned by the sun. What was step two? Sort of, I think it was in the 19th century, Charles Darwin did what Copernicus and Galileo did to the earth with the human person. So we took the human person, which had always been considered to be created by God in some way, and replaced that with an animal, an evolved animal that is the result of several billion years of struggle and killing and evolution. And now we have this creature. And then I think today, and we see this especially in a place like Seattle, where we have the Paul Allen Brain Institute, we have University of Washington doing incredible neuroscientific work. What is the sort of the last holdout of religious sort of belief, createdness? It's consciousness. It's human consciousness. It's freedom of the will. It is the emotions actually pointing towards something real. But what is sort of the story? What's the narrative today? It's that just like the earth was dethroned, the human body was dethroned from its sacredness, and now we have the mind, the last frontier. And what do we see in ethics? Ethics is an interesting thing. We see another kind of, I would say, another story of tyranny, which is the story that in the old days, where did ethics come from? At least, pre-Enlightenment. Ethics came from God. God, in the Judeo-Christian story, revealed how human beings ought to behave. And in the Ten Commandments, in the Torah, in the laws of the Hebrew Bible, and in sort of Jesus Christ's teachings to the Christian church. And then we knew what to do because a book told us to. But in the Enlightenment, people sort of supplanted that with human reason. And out of that emerged a new story, a story that said we don't need to be told what to do. We can discover it for ourselves. We can think our way into right and wrong. And so out of that, you have blooming these various thinkers who, in various traditions, have attempted to secure a morality external to the human body, so something that actually is objective out there, but does not need to point in any way, shape, or form to human life and morality being created. But instead, it is created. Well, there's a new creator. It's us. So those are sort of, as I see them, four major reasons, historical narratives, that will lead a lot of people, myself included, to think and question, not just do we need religion, but actually quite to the contrary, should we escape from religious belief and religious convictions in order to achieve something better? And is religion, in fact, a danger to our scientific progress and morality as a whole? So I think those are sort of the stories as I see them. And again, I'm not judging them for or against. I think those are really the stories that we live in. That is the narrative that we dwell in here in this particular time and place, Seattle, Washington, 2019.
Yeah. So it sort of brings us to the present moment. That's sort of the history of how we got here. And then the question that we have to ask, and I think we should ask and continue to wrestle with, is, has science progressed in such a way that we don't need these other streams?
Yeah, what do we think about what do we think about those stories?
Where is the science at? And I'm just a lowly pastor here, but but I think the question of love is a helpful category to think through. Have we understood the mind and neuroscience in such a way that we understand love? And that for me is a helpful one. I remember a conversation I had with a friend. We were discussing love, and he defined it as an economic exchange. And I've always thought about that. I've wrestled with that.
What did he mean by that, you think?
That it was nothing more than human beings involved in economics with one another, and as soon as that economic exchange was not beneficial, then love cease to exist. And that was sort of, this is a friend that I love dearly, and I don't think love can be answered with science or economics alone. I think love is something more than that, but what say you? What say you?
Right. So, and we're going to be doing our first question and answer session in 5 or 7 minutes. So think about some of the things we've said. Because again, like, I don't think I have the answers here. I think that, there's 2 people that I really like to read. One is a theologian named Stanley Hauerwas. The other is a philosopher named Stanley Cavell. They both have named Stanley. I'm going to name my child Stanley if I ever have one. But with their own respective fields, Cavell says the work of philosophy is never complete. Hauerwas says something similar. He says the work of theology is never complete, right? So what does that mean? It means, guess what it means? It means more. It means what the Consider Project is all about. It means that we are always seeking the next answer to the next question. Philosophically speaking, there's the fancy word of dialectic. It means that there are ideas engaging with each other since the beginning of human sort of questioning, since the beginning of language, and they will probably continue forever and ever. Excitedly, we get to be part of that story. And that's, for me, what makes doing ethics and being a human being so radically wild and exciting. It's that we actually get to grapple with these questions and we get to create the future, right? So that's why we have to resist complacency with doing things like considering. So what do I think about these sort of 4 sort of tensions or ways that science and religion are enemies? Well, I mean, I think that, so I'll take one step back and say, if you're in academics or you read people who talk about religion or you talk about science, or what you see is a lot of black and white thinking. And that is the other thing that I want us to resist tonight and forever into the future, which is to say that, I disagree with what that person says about that one small thing, and so nothing they say from here on after can be true. Or that statement is false and in every way, every formulation of it. No, some people say things I disagree with, and then they say a lot of other things I really strongly agree with, and that's why we can talk to each other and actually learn something. So we cannot demonize each other. I mean, you guys, we live in this politically charged world where it's just like you feel like everything you might say just could like turn into a typhoon, an explosion of anger from someone else. And so we have to we have to move past that and actually talk to each other. But so that, I'm just going to say a couple quick things about that history. First, the world of the Enlightenment, out of which the questions that Copernicus was grappling with, that Galileo was grappling with, that Darwin was grappling with, a century or 2 later. This was a world where everyone believed in God. So that's the strange thing. That's the thing we have to all take a step back from and realize is that it is a cultural fact that these people believed in God in a created world, one that was bestowed with laws that the human intellect could discover. And there's a lot of recent scholarship in the history of science showing that and trying to ask why. I mean, why didn't science emerge out of other cultures? Why did it emerge out of Western Europe in a particular period of time with a particular group of thinkers who were engaging reality in a particular way? Now, there are perhaps a lot of answers to that, but it is a historical fact that these were people who believed in God. People like Copernicus and Galileo and Descartes, all of the empiricist thinkers like John Locke and Spinoza, plus or minus, and Immanuel Kant, these people who were grappling with these questions about what is real and what is reality. In the background, they were the products of a religious culture. They weren't working with assumptions. So I think that's something we have to remember. And even when we today hear the language of rights, or we talk about dignity, or we talk about respect, we have to ask ourselves the question, whether we are religious or not, we are the children of Judeo-Christian thinking in America. And we are given the categories out of which we think. When we see human beings, even if we are atheists, we exist in a world where our language, our words, and our descriptions are given to us by our past. And that past, out of which science emerged, was a Judeo-Christian thinking group of people that were thinking in a certain way. And we're relying on a belief. This is what I think is really cool. The belief that the mind was created by God to be able to apprehend truth about reality. And for me, this is the ringer argument for why I cannot be an atheist. And it is because of this. If we look at evolution, we have to ask ourselves, what does evolution do? What is it for? What does it create? And just to make sure we all know that when Darwin put forth evolution, there were a lot of religious thinkers who adapted evolution into their various religious narratives. And the Catholic Church, from a very extremely early stage, worked with evolution and said, this is how God created human life. Like, there had to be a process. This is just the process. So, setting aside all the debate around evolution, let's say, though, that it happened in a way without any kind of intelligible direction, right? What happens? Well, Neanderthals ultimately, through the evolutionary process, emerge into human beings. Now, what can evolution produce in terms of a mind that can answer the question, there is or is not a God, truthfully? In fact, what even is truth and knowledge in a world where evolution was the engine that created all of you and me, and evolution alone? I cannot see, and if someone can answer this, please do, ask the question, how that process could create a mind that was tuned to answering the question, there is or is not a God. Because that is not what evolution does. Evolution creates material bodies, bags of atoms, that replicate better and more effectively than all the other bags of atoms. It does not care if these creatures that we are can say true or false things about God. So if you do not believe in God, I cannot understand how you could ever possibly believe yourself when you say there is no God. Because that's not what we can do. We cannot say there is no God unless, paradoxically, there is a God. I don't know if we're following that argument. That's going to be a question. Good. I want it. And so if we are merely bags of material going through life, I do not believe that we can truthfully say there is or is not a God. To look back, there's a man named Jean Piaget, who was a child psychologist and theorist, and he posited the stages of development of children. I'm a pediatrician, so I study Piaget. And children, as many of you know, are pediatric nurses and other pediatricians in this room, go through stages of development. So when a child is very young, they don't know anything about object permanence. So you have a candy bar, or you have a dog, or you have a ball, and they see it, and then you move it behind a curtain, and for the child, it disappears. And do we judge that the child was somehow deficient? No, we say, you just don't have the machinery to know that the ball is real or is not. Why should we think, as more developed beings, that we have the machinery to say that God exists or not? Because just like the young, undeveloped child, we are merely smears of material that is going to be gone and entirely inconsequential in not too long. especially if we keep, burning fossil fuels and polluting the environment with carbon. And Lawrence Kohlberg, who is another child psychologist, posited something called the stages of moral development, right? So you can take the same argument about morality and say, he says when you're very young, you look at right and wrong in a certain kind of way. It's punishment or not. And as you get older, you eventually, when you're developed, learn to be able to say, oh, there are some human principles, right? Like equity or, the golden rule sort of situation. But again, those moral rules don't actually tell us anything about reality as is. They just are what we do, what we think, how we feel, right? So that kind of is in the backdrop of why I believe that having a mind that can actually decipher between truth and falsehoods about reality, about the material world, as a part of the material world, yet a being that can distinguish what is true and false, both in terms of objects and structures and also moral truths, requires there to be some kind of createdness, some kind of givenness, some kind of standard that we can be measured against. And again, this is something, right, that this debate has filled so many libraries across the world. And my best friend John, or one of my best friends, John, is a serious committed atheist. I don't think John is here. And I have learned more from discussing this and him interrogating me and me interrogating him than I have in probably reading any book by a religious writer. So again, in the spirit of this being a conversation, I feel like I kind of went off the rails on that one, but it's.
Let me bring us back.
I think it's really important,
Okay.
and it's critical for us to think about when we think about the mind, what we're up to when we think, and how we talk about these items.
Yeah, so the big question of that section was, well, that's the history of it, but has it proven itself out, and do we no longer need religious faith in order to keep moving forward? And as a person of faith myself and a pastor, I think the answer that you're telling me, and I think it to be true, is that it takes faith regardless of what kind of faith it is. We need faith to move forward. So if you think about what hope is this distant thing that we think we can get to, and faith is the fuel that gets us there. So it's the substance that leads towards the hope of what we believe we can do. And as I see it, people of faith, if you're thinking about religious faith or Christian faith or Jewish faith or the Muslim faith, have a faith and a promise of a God that will lead to the hope. Science is the same way. What we have learned so far, the evidence that we've gathered, provides in us the substance, which is our faith, that if we keep going in this way, we'll reach this future hope. And what I would say, and then we're going to ask our questions. What I would say is, when it comes to coming up with bioethical standards and norms and ethics in general, if we limit the kind of faith, the kind of fuel that we can put in our car to get us up over that mountain to that thing we hope in, if we limit that to one or the other, either just faith in a God or faith in science, we won't get all the way there. But actually, when we have, and I think as a Christian, I believe in the scientific method, and I have faith that leads to hope in the things that science and human minds can come up with. When we actually pair those together, the fuel that we have can take us much further than if we limit the fuel that we'll put in our tanks to one or the other. And so that's a question, what is faith, and how is it related to hope? And we'll get into that more in our final section. But right now I want to invite up my friend Jeff. Jeff's a great considerer, and he's got a little game for us, and he's going to explain it to us. And this is a different way of doing Q&A. Jeff, why don't you explain to them why we're doing it